Alright, so today I want to talk about one of the most popular, and honestly one of the most misunderstood, crossover debates in science fiction. That being the USS Enterprise D versus an Imperial II class Star Destroyer. This matchup has been around for years. In fact, Eckhart's Ladder did a well-known video back on 2017. More recently, T-Voice Nuclear released a response that leaned pretty heavily into real-world engineering and power scaling. I'm going to link both of those videos below, and you can judge for yourself based on what they say. Now, before I go any further, I want to be clear about something right up front. I'm not making this video out to debunk or dump on either of them. Both videos are pretty thoughtful, and both are interesting and useful. But they're useful in a very specific way, because they show two extremely common approaches people take when comparing fictional universes. And I think both approaches miss the part that actually decides this fight. If your mental image right now of this mashup is two ships sitting 10 kilometers apart hammering on each other until one explodes, that assumption alone has already decided the outcome. So what I want to do here is something a little different. Not which universe has the bigger numbers. I'm not going to look at whose tech manuals look scarier, and I'm definitely not going to look at my favorite franchise wins. I like both of these franchises. In fact, I think Babylon 5 and Firefly are better franchises, but, that's just my own personal opinion. So, instead, I want to look at how these ships are actually depicted fighting in their own stories, shows, movies, and what assumptions they operate under, what problems they're designed to solve, and exactly how their commanders are trained to think. Because, yes, both of these universes are fictional, but they're not random. They have internal rules, they have doctrine, they have defaults, and we're going to look at those. When you compare those defaults honestly, the outcome of this mashup becomes a lot clearer. Now this video is certainly a detachment from my regular videos. There's a lot more editing, post-processing, and all that goes into this video, and I don't necessarily know exactly how it's going to look when it's done. That said, Eckhart's original video explicitly chose to avoid tactics and focus on the ships as platforms, a kind of what are the stats comparison. Now, that's a perfectly valid choice, especially if you want to avoid things like plot armor or main character bias. The trade-off in that is that when you remove tactics and doctrine from a ship fight, you're also removing the very things that determine whether raw power ever gets brought to bear in the first place. On the other side of the coin, T-Voice Nuclear leans heavy into power scaling, energy output, and real-world engineering intuition, especially when it comes to things like reactors and weapons. I genuinely appreciate that angle. I mean, it's interesting and fun. The problem is that once you start hanging the entire outcome on extrapolated energy numbers, especially numbers derived from superweapons, you stop analyzing how the ships actually fight on screen. You start deciding the winner based on whose spreadsheet looks scarier. That's where the debate goes off the rails. So my goal here is simple. I'm going to judge each ship by the combat assumptions it actually operates under in canon, not fan math, not doomsday weapons, just the ships, their crews, and how they're shown to engage hostile vessels. So the ground rules for this matchup are going to be pretty simple. This isn't the Empire versus the Federation, and it's not some galactic war. This is a single encounter between two ships, both with crews competent and behaving according to their universe's normal doctrine. When I say realistic, I don't mean realistic physics. Neither franchise has that. What I mean is realistic relative to what we actually see on screen. If a tactic works, it's on the table. If a limitation appears, it counts. There's no special pleading here. There's no my universe cancels yours. And there's no bias towards Star Trek or Star Wars in any way. We're just dealing with specific situations. And this analysis deliberately excludes edge case tactics that don't represent how either universe is normally depicting these ships in combat. This is just what happens when each ship fights the way it's built to fight and the way it's depicted to fight. Now, whenever this debate comes up, everybody seems to jump straight to weapon power. But before we even talk about weapons, this fight is going to be shaped by one massive asymmetry: scanning capability. In Star Trek, scanning is not a vague concept. It's a core operational tool. Starfleet sensor suites routinely provide detailed, long-range information on internal structures, power distribution, shield behavior, propulsion systems, and subsystem layout, often in real time. This level of sensor resolution isn't rare, it's normal. It's how Starfleet evaluates unknown contacts, prepares first contact, and, when necessary, even plans precision combat actions. In Star Wars, sensors are depicted very differently. Imperial ships can detect contacts, track motion, estimate mass, and infer some basic power output or shield preferences. But they rarely demonstrate detailed internal resolution without visual confirmation, close range, or boarding actions. In other words, you need to get somebody on board a ship to find out what's there. This asymmetry actually matters, because by the time an Imperial Star Destroyer begins maneuvering to understand what it's actually facing, the Enterprise has already built a complete tactical picture. And this isn't a rare or exceptional behavior in Star Trek. This is actually how Starfleet evaluates everything from anomalies to first contact to hostile encounters. And now the next biggest point of asymmetry, and a fact that people seem to gloss over, is the fact that Star Trek ships don't fight at a nice range unless there's something that's gone terribly wrong. Dialogue across the Next Generation consistently places standard ship-to-ship interactions, including hostile encounters, at tens of thousands of kilometers distant. A clean example is during A Matter of Honor, where the Enterprise explicitly establishes a position at 27,000 kilometers before it hails to converse with another ship. In Star Wars, capital ship combat, by contrast, is consistently depicted at very close ranges, visually close. Even generous interpretations put most engagements within a few thousand kilometers, often much closer than that. That means something extremely important to this matchup. The Enterprise can engage and disengage long before an Imperial-class Star Destroyer is in a position to bring its main weapons to bear. So now that we're talking about weapons and specifically, or more specifically, geometry of attack, let's talk about how those weapons are used. With an Imperial Star Destroyer, the weapons are basically designed around overwhelming firepower. You have hundreds of turbo lasers, ion cannons, and fighters in order to saturate an area with destruction. This works extremely well against targets that can't control engagement, distance, or geometry. But precision targeting isn't their strength. On the other side, in Star Trek, precision is the point. The Enterprise has repeatedly used phasers for surgery, planetary drilling, and selective combat disablement. A textbook example of that is during the episode The Wounded, where the Enterprise disables a warship by targeting key systems rather than just battering it into debris. Starfleet's doctrine favors disabling, not annihilating. And none of this is an argument that Imperial weapons are weak. It's an argument that overwhelming power only matters if you can force your opponent into the range and geometry where that firepower applies. Now, despite its size, the Enterprise D is repeatedly shown to maneuver in ways that, at least by Star Wars capital ship standards, would be considered exceptional. In the neutral zone, it executes a rapid reversal and rotation maneuver. In Generations, it performs a high-speed banking turn at full impulse before jumping to warp. As well, numerous Borg encounters reinforce it and show that the Galaxy class isn't really a dogfighter, but it can reposition very quickly and decisively when the situation demands. Imperial Star Destroyers, by contrast, are at their most dangerous when they can establish a stable firing geometry. whether that's a forward engagement or a broadside where large numbers of heavy weapons can be brought to bear at once. The limitation isn't firepower, it's responsiveness. ISDs are massive vessels optimized for intimidation, area control, and sustained pressure. Changing orientation, reestablishing fire solutions, and reacting to rapid lateral repositioning all take time. Time that the Enterprise doesn't have to give them. And that matters because Starfleet doctrine doesn't require the Enterprise to outturn or outgun a Star Destroyer. It only requires it to stay mobile enough to deny the ISD a clean, stable engagement window. That's a very different kind of maneuverability, and it's exactly the kind that would decide this kind of fight. So you probably noticed by now that I've been staying away from the numbers. I haven't talked about how powerful the turbolaser is, or how strong each ship's shields are, or what kind of raw output the reactors can produce. That's not because those things don't matter. It's because, in the proper context of this matchup, they have no actual bearing on the outcome. In a brute force encounter, with ships only 1,000 meters apart, those numbers certainly become relevant. In a lore accurate matchup of these two ships, however, this encounter never gets to that point. What decides this encounter isn't who has the bigger gun or the hottest reactor. It's who gets to choose the distance, the angles, and the timing, and who doesn't. With that in mind, you can all put your spreadsheets away. Now let's now slow this down a little bit and actually picture what a confrontation between these two ships would look like, moment by moment, if both ships behave the way that their universes consistently show them behaving. Everything about this confrontation starts quietly. As hyperspace travel would prevent the Star Destroyer from detecting the Enterprise, we'll have to assume the Star Destroyer is in normal space and the Enterprise detects it while it's at warp. This isn't out of the ordinary. Federation ship sensors are always detecting things while traveling at warp. However, this appears to be an anomaly of some kind, a ship that shouldn't be in this space. Not knowing what they're getting into, the Enterprise will of course drop out far enough away that the Star Destroyer is little more than a distant shape against the stars. Not close, not dramatic, just unmistakably there. At first, all is quiet. The Enterprise holds position and begins doing what Starfleet ships always do in uncertain encounters. It observes. Sensors reach out across the darkness of space. Data accumulates about the Star Destroyer. The tactical officer starts to form an image of what the ship is, what it's capable of, and what it's used for. And the captain attempts to make contact with the ISD commander. Across that same distance, in the Star Destroyer, reactions are vastly different. Imperial doctrine takes over as its commander feels the instinctive need to confront the much smaller intruder. The incoming hail is disregarded by the comm officer as nothing but meaningless radio noise. If anything, he'll throw it through a computer processing just to see what is going on. The shields are raised, its course is adjusted, and just briefly you'll see that massive triangular hull begin to turn slowly and deliberately, like something that demands respect from anything it faces. The Empire doesn't communicate, after all, they intimidate. The Enterprise doesn't rush forward. It doesn't retreat either. By now, its tactical officer has identified the threat, detected their firing vectors, analyzed their power systems, made note of their maneuvering capabilities, scanned their shields, and relayed all this information to his captain. This isn't abnormal stuff. This is stuff that they would be able to detect, and they would be able to process, and they would be able to react to. Instead of approaching, the much more maneuverable Enterprise simply slides sideways. Not evasively, not urgently, just enough to keep the ISD's attack angles wrong. From the outside, it probably looks like almost nothing is happening between the two ships. They're just sitting there, hanging in space, one drifting slightly off to the side. To those on board the ships, however, the fight is already being shaped. The Star Destroyer keeps advancing, not just to close the distance, but to line itself up. Forward arcs, broadside arcs, It tries to get any geometry that turns their size and firepower into leverage over their confrontation. Every time it adjusts, the Enterprise adjusts too, staying just off axis, never giving them a clean firing line. At this point, neither ship's fired a shot, but one ship is certainly dictating the terms of this engagement. The Star Destroyer is already within the Enterprise's firing window, and it continues to struggle to get the Enterprise in range and on target. The Enterprise's captain, however, continues to follow procedure to hold fire until force becomes necessary. Then, everything changes. Fed up with the lack of progress in this engagement, the commander of the ISD suddenly begins to launch their squadrons of TIE fighters. You can picture them peeling away from the Star Destroyer's hull in small clusters, then spreading out and accelerating hard across the gap between the two ships. This isn't for show. This is the first real attempt of the Star Destroyer to force the engagement. Fighters don't need perfect geometry after all. They don't need their targets to be close. They're fast enough to reach out and make contact even while the capital ships remain separated. The situation tightens. For the Enterprise, drifting along is no longer an option, because even if the Enterprise stays out of range of the Imperial Star Destroyer, those fighters won't. This is the moment where the Federation restraint reaches its limit. Up until now, the Enterprise has avoided escalating this confrontation. It's held its distance, it's attempted communication, it's denied combat favorable alignments without opening fire on the ISD. With attack craft now closing in, and the Star Destroyer still pressing forward, continued inaction doesn't preserve the peace. It hands control of the fight to the Empire. This is where the Enterprise's response changes, and this is where weapons finally matter. When the Enterprise fires, it doesn't do so because it's rushed in. It never needed to. Phasers aren't built for spectacle. They're built for reach and precision. At this distance, tens of thousands of kilometers away, they're already operating comfortably. The same can't be said for the Star Destroyer's turbolasers. They're a much more devastating weapon, but they're designed for fights that happen much closer, where targets fill your display screens instead of hovering far off in the distance. So the first shots in this confrontation don't cross space in both directions. They only go one way. You can imagine a thin, orange-focused lance of energy reaching out towards the ISD. Not a barrage, not a storm of firepower, just a beam simply touching specific points along the massive ship's profile. It doesn't touch the hull in random locations either. It doesn't bounce around the shields hoping to find an opening. It strikes with pinpoint precision, sustained beams that the Star Destroyer's shields were never designed to defend against. Power routing systems, shield emitters, launch bays, sensors, all of these key systems become precision targets for the scalpel of energy reaching out from the Enterprise. Nothing explodes dramatically, but several key systems on board the ISD no longer behave the way they did a moment ago. The Star Destroyer tries to respond, of course. It shifts power, it works to reorient and bring its guns to bear, but this is where the geometry of the battle changes again. The Enterprise doesn't sit still. It begins a wide, deliberate arc, sliding around the Star Destroyer's flank, maintaining distance while moving towards the rear quarter of the ISD. It doesn't do this in a tight loop. It uses its speed advantage to make the pass in a wide curve, measured and controlled. This is the most dangerous part of the encounter for the Enterprise, even though it's not really dangerous at all. As the Enterprise swings through that broadside arc, there are brief moments where the angles tighten, moments where, if the Star Destroyer could react quickly enough, heavy weapons just might be able to make a difference. That risk is real, but this is where earlier choices also matter. The Enterprise has already done damage to the ISD. Power fluctuations delay response, uneven propulsion slows rotation, degraded sensors make tracking harder, especially against a ship that refuses to fly in a straight line. The Enterprise doesn't linger in that danger window either. It passes through it just long enough to exploit it, and then keeps moving. All the while, the TIE fighters are still in play. They streak in and out, firing their laser cannons in a futile attempt to do damage, but forcing defensive responses and demanding attention. The Enterprise can't just ignore them, any more than you could ignore a swarm of mosquitoes around your head. Thus the phaser arrays, which cover virtually every angle of the ship, continuously fire across wide arcs. They snap between targets, obliterating the virtually unprotected TIE fighters one at a time. The fighters certainly add pressure, and undoubtedly complicate the picture. But what they don't do is take control of the situation or pose any real threat. They can't pin the Enterprise in place long enough for the Star Destroyer to capitalize, and they can't do enough damage to slow the Enterprise. And, on top of that, the coordination aboard the carrier degrades, the fighters start to feel it too. They'll have mistimed runs, broken formations, delayed recoveries. All of this will happen as more damage is done to both the fighters and the ISD. They're still an annoyance, they're just not decisive. Eventually, the shape of the fight is going to settle. The Star Destroyer is still massive, still armed, still imposing. Nothing about it looks defeated. The Enterprise, having now moved in behind the ISD, uses its advantage to bring the threat to an end. With several precision strikes, the ISD's engines go dark. It can't turn anymore. It can't chase. It can't bring its guns to bear. For all intensive purposes, the massive ship is disabled. The Enterprise, by contrast, is still moving, still able to choose angles, still deciding when to be visible and when to drift just out of reach. This is where the encounter ends, not with a retreat, but with containment. The Enterprise doesn't rush in to finish the job, but it also doesn't leave. It holds position, at a controlled distance, on a skewed angle, close enough to act yet far enough to remain safe. From here, the balance of power is unmistakable. Any attempt by the Star Destroyer to re-escalate, to launch more fighters, to realign weapons, to force the issue again, would be visible immediately and would be met with the same precise response that put it in this position in the first place. This is the part of the fight that isn't flashy, but is very Star Trek. There's no annihilation, there's no victory lap, just the quiet reality that the threat is now neutralized. And when a ship built to dominate through presence can no longer translate that presence into action, the fight is over, even if the ship itself is still very much intact. As a final thought, this matchup has never actually been a question of which universe has the most powerful technology. It's a question of what problems that technology is designed to solve, and the training instituted to use it. Imperial Star Destroyers are built to dominate through fear and brute force. They intimidate and overwhelm their targets in situations that they are comfortable with. Their commanders are rewarded for aggression, certainty, and forward momentum. When an Imperial commander encounters resistance, their doctrine encourages closing the distance and committing assets until the problem simply goes away. On the other side, Galaxy-class starships are built to detect, analyze, adapt, and control engagements at extreme standoff distances. Their captains are trained to operate far from support in unknown space against situations that don't often fit a predefined threat model. When a Starfleet captain encounters resistance, their doctrine encourages buying time, gathering information, and reshaping the situation to benefit themselves. The Enterprise doesn't win by trading broadsides with an Imperial Star Destroyer. It wins by never allowing the fight to be fought on Imperial terms in the first place. And in any universe, fictional or real, that kind of battlefield control is what actually decides the outcome. That's really the point which people tend to miss when these debates turn into spreadsheet wars, calculation arguments, and measuring contests over who's got the best fictional superweapon. Raw power only matters after both sides have already agreed, or been forced, to fight inside the same constraints. If one side can control distance, geometry, escalation, then the question of who hits harder never gets asked in the first place. That doesn't make Imperial technology the weaker, and it doesn't make Starfleet technology the stronger. It means they're built for fundamentally different assumptions about how conflicts begin, how they escalate, and how they end. When you take each ship out of its native context and put them face to face, the outcome isn't decided by which reactor is hotter or which gun has the bigger yield. It's decided by which ship gets to decide how the fight actually happens. Once you look at the matchup through that lens, the conclusion stops being controversial. It just becomes consistent. This is Jodian Gaming signing off. Thanks for watching.